Good morning. Today is January 28th, 2020, and my name is Michael Conley, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations of the North Reading Public Schools. And today I'm going to go over some information. We are kicking off our school budget process, so I'm going to kind of review the budget calendar, and the governor released their state budget recently, and we're going to kind of talk about the Chapter 70 formula and the governor's budget and sort of what it means for North Reading at this point in the budget process. Some of the main topics I'm going to talk about is certainly the budget calendar for FY21. As I just mentioned, the state budget and this new Student Opportunities Act and what that means for both the state and North Reading, the Chapter 70 program, discuss some of our preliminary budget challenges that we see at this point in the process, and then as we move through key budget dates in the coming weeks and months, how the community can access key budget information. So here's our budget calendar that we've been following over the past several years. We're going to release our budget in about the middle of February, our preliminary recommended superintendent budget. That budget will be presented to the school committee on March 2nd. That will be at 6:30 in the Distance Learning Lab. We will hold our annual school budget webinar on Friday, March 27th at 12 p.m. We will have a school committee budget workshop on April 1st. We will have our annual public hearing on the budget on April 13th. If necessary, we will hold another budget workshop on April 29th, and then the school committee will vote the recommended budget on May 4th. We'll present that budget to the Finance Committee on May 6th, and then town meeting will occur on Monday, June 8th. So the state budget was released on Wednesday, January 22nd, and the governor, certainly did a lot of things to support the new Student Opportunity Act initiative, which was enacted a few months ago. And the governor took some really good first steps to essentially fully fund the first year of the Student Opportunity Act initiative, which essentially increases educational funding significantly over a period of the next 7 years. So essentially about $1.5 billion is the estimated amount of new funding for education that is being certainly allocated and increased as part of the Student Opportunities Act. So it's certainly an ambitious bill that was recently approved. It's a commitment to significantly increase funding for education. This funding will mainly be through the Chapter 70 state aid formula. Again, it's over a 7-year period. It's certainly geared towards mostly assisting those communities that have the highest need, the biggest achievement gaps, the highest population of low-income students. So North Reading, you'll find in a moment, it doesn't currently stand to significantly financially benefit from the act, although it will certainly see a benefit. Most of the funds that are being increased into education as part of the bill will go towards making changes to the foundation budget as part of the Chapter 70 program by changing the way the healthcare costs are calculated in that formula, making those healthcare costs more aligned with actual healthcare cost increases, aligning those increases with the GIC, the state health insurance plan. So that's long been an issue with the formula, as well as adjusting the calculation involved in both in-district and out-of-district special education costs. The annual rate increase in that formula is being increased to more accurately reflect actual cost trends in this area. So those were certainly the two of the biggest areas. The Foundation Review Commission of the Chapter 70 formula cited as the biggest issues in the calculation of the foundation budget, and certainly the Student Opportunities Act and the governor's budget goes to significantly support many of those changes to better reflect actual increases and actual expenditure trends, both in those two high-cost areas of healthcare and special education. So it's certainly a commitment to fund the $1.5 billion over a 7-year period. As I said earlier, the governor's budget would fully fund these initiatives. It also supports increases to the special education circuit breaker program. The budget increases funding by about $17.3 million. This is mainly due to a commitment to both fully fund that program as also to support the addition of adding special education transportation costs as part of that formula over a 4-year period where those costs will be phased in. It also makes changes to the kind of the threshold, which was always 4 times the pure pupil state funding rate, which was about approximately $45,000 this past year. That threshold is no longer going to be tied to the 4 times the state pure pupil rate. It's more going to kind of move with inflation. So the idea is that also should help districts as well. And it also significantly increases funding for charter school reimbursements for districts as well. So that increase in the state budget was about $23.2 million, and the Chapter 78 increases a little over $303 million. So certainly a good first step in the governor's budget by supporting the initiatives of the Student Opportunities Act, and then certainly the House and the Senate would be next to sort of review the budget. So here we are in January. The governor's released the budget. It's going to move on to the House Ways and Means Committee, and then it will move on to the Senate, and hopefully around June till July, the state will have kind of a final budget. This is the process, the state budget process. So the Chapter 70 program and kind of what it looks like for North Reading. I've shown this slide over the past number of years, and as you know, the foundation budget is calculated for each district, which is meant to represent the minimum spending level needed to provide an adequate education. So this is, you can see kind of the foundation budget over the past 2-year comparison for North Reading, fiscal 20, which is the current year that we're in, and the FY21 proposed governor's state budget. So you can see that the increase is pretty significant in the foundation budget, mainly due to some of the Student Opportunities Act changes in that formula of that foundation budget calculation. That's always the first step. The formula calculates that foundation budget, which is certainly driven by the enrollment and as well as inflation, would be the 2 main factors in that calculation of the district's foundation budget. Changes in student demographics, grade levels, low income status, English language proficiency all play a role and a factor in determining that calculation, but that certainly is step 1 of the process. Step 2 would be to calculate what the community can afford, and this is known as the required district local contribution. And this essentially represents the amount of local appropriations needed to meet required net school spending. So again, several variables go into that factor, but they certainly calculate the local contribution and assessment of what each community can afford. And then the difference tends to be is your Chapter 70 aid, which essentially represents the amount of state aid to finance the state share of the foundation budget, which is generally composed of foundation aid, growth aid, minimum aid, and so forth. But the sum of the local contribution plus the Chapter 70 aid is your required net school spending amount. The required net school spending amount is the amount each district is required to spend, and it must be equal or greater than the foundation budget. So in our case, the required net school spending amount for North Reading is greater than the foundation budget, and that has a lot to do with the fact that we are well above our target aid share in our percent of Chapter 70 of foundation, as you can see by this summary chart. We are a minimum aid community, being in the eyes of the formula. North Reading's Chapter 70 target as a percent of foundation is 17.5%, which is the lowest amount. So in the eyes of the formula, we look at median income, property values in North Reading. We are considered an affluent community, and if everything was functioning as the formula should, we would be due to receive the minimum amount of 17.5%. But as you can see, we are receiving 28.24% in the formula, about 11 or so percent above our target, which is it counts to about $2.7 million of more aid than what the formula feels like we should be receiving. So for the past several years, and you'll see by some additional charts I will show, North Reading, when there has been major changes or initiatives or Chapter 70 reform, we've always kind of defaulted to a minimum pure pupil amount. And in North Reading, over the last several years, that's been about $30 per pupil when the budget's been approved. So that's kind of where we're at. And if you look at this chart, that kind of shows you what I've just been speaking to. So there are many parts of Chapter 78. There's down payment aid, foundation aid, growth aid. Those are some of the most common. And then there's minimum aid. So the state sets a minimum per pupil amount, and it's been anywhere between $20 and as high as $50 or $70 in the past several years. And North Reading has always defaulted, at least since fiscal year 12, to that minimum aid amount, which over since fiscal 18 has been pretty consistently funded at about $30 per pupil. And I believe the Student Opportunities Act initiative sort of raises that baseline per pupil amount from what was maybe starting at $20 or $25. It raises that amount to $30. So North Reading is due to receive an additional approximately $70,000 in new Chapter 70 amount based on the $30 per pupil at our foundation enrollment amount, which is the $2,320 times 30 is the $69,600 of increase in our Chapter 70 aid that you see playing out. So because we're in this scenario where we're so far above our target, 28% of Chapter 78 is a percent of our foundation, where the formula is saying we should be at 17.5%. We sort of default to only receiving the minimum amount of aid because of that dynamic that's at play with the formula. So you can see, again, target to actual aid percentages. So you can see that our target is much lower. Since about fiscal 14, we've been at the minimum at 17.5%. And we've been receiving just under 30% over the last several years. So that this main difference, to me, generally is the reason why North Reading, when there are major changes like the Foundation Review Commission recommendations that get enacted into the Chapter 70 formula, like the Student Opportunities Act, we, right, wrong, or indifferent, are not due to receive large increases in Chapter 70. We default to that minimum aid that I just spoke to. This graph over time can show you where we are at with relation to our required net school spending amount. So the blue represents the foundation budget, the blue striped line bar graph. Again, that is the minimum amount set by the state that we're required to spend to meet in an adequate education. The state, as you say, then, as I said earlier, then calculates what a community can afford, and they come up with the amount of Chapter 70 aid, and that represents our required net school spending. So you can see, because we're receiving more Chapter 70 than the state feels like we should, our required net school spending line, this dotted gray line, is higher than the foundation budget, at least going back to fiscal year 10, so for the last several years. The difference between those numbers tends to be our Chapter 78. So we don't receive a lot of Chapter 78 since we are a minimum aid community. And then we, like many other communities in the dark blue line, are spending for the last several years far greater than what we are required to spend. We're spending on average about 30% more than the required net school spending. That's the delta between these two lines, which, believe it or not, is a common statistic throughout the state. Most communities, about 2/3 of communities, spend more than they are required to spend by the state. The state average is about 27%. So we are spending just about or slightly above the state average in terms of exceeding our required level of spending. When you look at some of our area communities that sort of touch North Reading demographically and geographically, with Linfield, Reading, Wilmington, Wakefield, you can sort of see that most of these communities are really considered minimum aid communities in the eyes of the formula, 17.5% communities. And you can see we're in North Reading, which is the blue line. We are about 11% or so above our target aid of 17.5%, whereas Wilmington's even a little bit further above or far from their target. Where communities like Linfield and Wakefield are much closer to their amount to their target, meaning they're receiving in the eyes of the formula the appropriate amount of Chapter 70 aid. So what that means is when there's a change in the formula or there's new initiatives to increase the foundation budget, or if they're due to receive larger increases in Chapter 70, and that's because they just happen to be closer to their target aid of 17.5%. So I think a lot of people don't quite realize that, and Chapter 70 is not a one size fits all. It's different. It works different for each community. The calculation, it's a very progressive calculation. It's meant to be progressive, and North Reading's in a situation where they're just not going to see large increases because we're just so far above where the state feels like we should be. So that this certainly brings up the conversation of full day kindergarten. Oftentimes you see districts move to free universal full day kindergarten. North Reading would love to do that. It's something that's been an objective of ours for a long time. We certainly believe in that. But communities that are in our area like Linfield and Wakefield and Stoneham, they've been able to do that a little bit easier because they are closer to their target age share. So when they make a change like that, they see the full benefit of that rate increase, and it does provide sort of an influx of Chapter 70 aid. North Reading would not qualify for that type of aid and wouldn't see a significant increase by making a change like that. And I don't think everyone realizes that when they see Linfield and Wakefield and Stoneham, a lot of area communities move towards the full day kindergarten, is that they were able to do it by getting some significant increases in Chapter 70, which North Reading and even a school like Wilmington and even Reading, for instance, who have not moved to the free full day kindergarten has been able to receive. So now that kind of gets into what are some preliminary funding challenges, and this is kind of the storyline that sort of plays itself over and over again, and there's this structural problem that exists when attempting to fund school and municipal budgets. As we all know, property taxes are capped at 2.5%. So the revenue into a community like North Reading is relatively stagnant, relatively flat. We have our state aid, which doesn't significantly increase or change from year to year. Our local receipts are relatively flat. It's limited of what we can bring in. We are starting to see some increases in new growth, and there's a chance we'll see some increases in real estate and property taxes, but those are relatively fixed, where some of the fixed cost items like healthcare, general liability insurance, retirement costs, regional school assessment costs have been going up between 4 and 8% annually. And when those increases almost double the increases of your revenue, you have this structural problem that exists on an ongoing basis. And that is certainly the challenge that we deal with when attempting to fund both school, town, municipal, city budgets. And that certainly is a trend that plays itself in North Reading. So the last slide I'm going to present this evening is just as we move through the budget process, we have some key dates in the coming weeks. You can access our budget calendar by going right to the school district website. There's a link that would bring up the preliminary budget calendar that I showed earlier in the presentation. And you can see where some key dates are in March and April when we're going to be publicly presenting the budget. You can actually access all of these budget documents, this presentation, preliminary presentation, the budget book, in detail by going to the budget link on our website. We have recently presented it and received approval of our 5-year capital plan. That is out there on the website and available to you. And not only will I be posting about 15, 20-minute videos like this one today, I'll also be posting links on Twitter on my @NRPS Finance Twitter feed as well, where you can follow a lot of key information about the North Reading budget as we move through the process. So that was my presentation today, meant to be an overview of the state budget and the Chapter 70 formula and the governor and what that meant for the state and North Reading. And hopefully as we move through this process, there'll be more information that will become available to you, and we hope that the community continues to get involved. Great. Thank you for your time.